Hello, and welcome to another question and answer session on David Starkey Talks. And can I just say how deeply impressive the questions are? So many of them touch big issues of nationhood and identity, and at the same time bring them back to now and to personal experience. I don't mean my truth and your truth. I mean the reality of lived experience, the reality of the present. In other words, exactly the kind of dialogue between past and present, and indeed future, that I'm trying to establish with David Starkey Talks. So wonderful that we're all actually on the same wavelength. I want to begin with a particularly interesting question. It's very long, it's complicated, I'll have to summarise it, and indeed I'm going to take more than one session to answer it. It comes from Calde, I think I've got that right, Kalde of Manchester. And it's a question really about the relationship between, if you like, the Celtic fringe, the Celtic nations, so-called, of Scotland, Ireland and Wales and England, and the notion of Britishness and its relationship with religion. Calder begins with a series of statements which are absolutely true. He summarised it with the opening sentence. Why does Henry VIII, he asks, reject his Welsh heritage? Then he goes on and he describes the Welshness or partial Welshness of Henry Tudor. He was, of course, born at Pembroke Castle. The name, that's the name that he gets from his grandfather, is thoroughly Welsh. The Welsh were, the Tudors were a Welsh princely dynasty. There were an awful lot of them. He goes on, as I said, born at Pembroke Castle. Henry then, of course, is driven into exile in Brittany, which speaks a version of Gaelic too. And it may very well be that Henry was able to speak in both Welsh Gaelic and Breton Gaelic. The fact is not absolutely known, but it's very possible. He's an excellent linguist. In fact, he is multilingual. A good Latinist, a good spoken Latin, excellent spoken French. In fact, it's probably his first language, all those years that he spends in Brittany, which is, of course, a French-speaking court. And finally, English, perhaps as a bit of an afterthought. We'll talk about the extent to which Henry VII, that is to say, sees himself as English at all, obviously King of England, but how far does he see himself as English? But back to the business of Welsh. So, born at Pembroke Castle, a family of Welsh descent, though remember, only his enemies ever call him Tudor. It's Richard III who calls him Tudor. Kings of England do not have surnames. Even the idea of Plantagenet is, well, iffy. So, that Welshness. The Welshness which expresses itself politically, because when he eventually returns, indeed, to launch the campaign, which culminates in his victory at Bosworth, he lands at Milford Haven. He draws on consciously Welsh connections. He assembles an army which has a significant Welsh element. And when, of course, he actually takes the throne, he has a Welsh guard. Most of the yeomen of the guard, or at least a very high proportion of the yeomen of the guard, this famous bodyguard, which he creates at the beginning of his reign, are Welsh, and they commemorate St. David's Day. The king gives a donation to his guards on St. David's Day, the business of the leek and all the rest of it. Again, naming of his son, his eldest son, named Arthur. The figure of the Matter of Britain, the supposed original British king, and so on. Things like Rouge Dragon, Red Dragon, one of the pursuivants of arms, one of the members of the College of Arms, one of the junior heralds, again echoes of Welsh. The standard, one of the standards at Bosworth, the Welsh Dragon. So lots and lots of invocations of Welshness, and clearly taking it, I think, fairly seriously. There have been arguments about how far we should take the naming of Arthur seriously. They largely depend on the fact that the whole business of the Arthurian legend isn't played at all seriously with. Indeed, is barely played with at all in the extremely elaborate series of pageants which are put on for the marriage of Arthur to Catherine of Aragon in November 1501. Well, there is a very good reason for that. If you think about it, the last model of a marriage you would have wanted would have been that of Arthur and Guinevere, famously, of course, usurped by Lancelot, and so on. So if you want an epithalamium, a celebration of marriage, you do not turn to King Arthur. He has many other qualities. But the seriousness of the idea of Arthur, of the Round Table, of if you like, the matter of Britain, I think is absolutely certain. It was a conscious decision. After all, it had to be a conscious decision to name your eldest son Arthur. And as I pointed out before, it's done not simply as a question of, oh, suck your thumb, what name shall we give him at the font? It's an extraordinarily deliberate enterprise, because Arthur is christened way, way out of the way in Winchester. Why is he christened in Winchester? Because Winchester by this point was actually thought, and this again raises the issue of Welshness. Winchester is now identified. The old Anglo-Saxon capital is now identified as the original Camelot. This is in the extraordinary reworking, the version of the Arthurian myth which is most prominent in the end of the 15th century England, Thomas Malory's Morte d'Arthur, where, again, I've talked about this a little bit before and I've written about it extensively. You can see the place names, the mythic place names. Remember, the Arthurian legend is invented in France. There is no doubt about it. The place names of the legend, these mysterious places, Shalott and Camelot and whatever, are progressively identified with real English places. Winchester being identified with Camelot, because of course in Winchester there hangs what was thought to be the Round Table. The Round Table actually put together by Edward III, but witnessed by Henry VII, and consciously invoked when he takes his eldest son, his firstborn, the little boy Arthur, when he takes him there, or of course he's actually inside his mother. The birth is deliberately engineered in Winchester. It's an extraordinary thing to do. It's a long journey. The weather is bad. Elizabeth of York is notoriously tender and sensitive during pregnancy. There is a purpose in doing it. This isn't an accidental staging post on a progress. It is a deliberate attempt. The boy is taken there to be born and to be christened. It's an extraordinary story. So Henry does indeed take the Welshness, the matter of Britain, Henry VII, that is, does take it very seriously. Which then raises the question, let's put it the other way around, and indeed what is completely missing out, I don't think you mentioned it once, Calde, in your question, England. Henry is King of England, Henry VII. But how far does he see himself as being English? Remember, he'd had virtually no experience of England. He is forced into exile as an early teenager. All his formative years are spent in Brittany or in France. His first language, the court of Brittany, is French speaking. It's a great one of the great semi-independent French duchies that was being reabsorbed into the French monarchy at this point. His first language is French. His entire familiarity with political institutions is French, not English. And I think he I think this is the key to understanding so much about Henry VII. He doesn't see himself as being particularly English. I don't think he feels very much sympathy for his English subjects. There's a famous report by the Spanish ambassador that he wished to rule the English in the French fashion. And if you look at the kind of government that he sets up, particularly towards the end of the reign, the use of figures like Empson and Dudley, the enormous development of the crown lands, the private finances as they're managed through the king's personal chamber. This is a profoundly personal form of government. It's one that in many ways stands aside from the parliamentary tradition, from the traditions of the institutions of government as they've been forged in the High Middle Ages, and of course conspicuously stands aside from the English warrior tradition of kingship in the struggle with France. So perhaps what we're looking at with Henry VII is a monarch who sees himself in a different tradition, as part of a francophone tradition, as a kind of, almost using a word that is a difficult and I think improper one, but it makes a point neatly, sees himself as a kind of international figure. We know from the comments of people like Polydore Virgil that he's very fond of foreigners. His personal library is largely in French, the magnificent collection of books that he builds up at Richmond. They're luxury editions, mainly of printed works, but printed works designed to look like manuscripts and very, very heavily illuminated and so on, printed on parchment, but they're almost all in French. Now, Henry VIII. The question is, why did Henry VIII reject his Welsh heritage? Well, I think you can produce a one-word answer to begin with, though the answer needs heavy elaboration, which, knowing me, you're going to get. Henry sees himself, unlike his father, he sees himself as English. And he had fundamentally an English upbringing and an English experience. And remember, he sees himself at least as much as Yorkist as he does as Lancastrian or Tudor. It's Henry VIII, for the first time, who regularly uses the double badge, the red and white badge, signifying the descent from both the famous houses of York and Lancaster. He is the first to use the Tudor rose because he is the first person to be descended from both sides, which is why Edmund Hall writes his great chronicle with the reign of Henry VIII as its climax, because he unites the warring roses. So Henry, I think, does see himself very differently. And of course his upbringing is so completely different from that extraordinary internationalism, the peripatetic quality, the wandering around of his father's life. I mean, remember, again, when Henry VII invades England in 1485, it's done with the backing of the French court. It's done with French ships. It's done with French money. It's done largely with French troops. And it's the French troops with their mastery of the pike that undoubtedly, I think, win the victory, or at least save him from defeat when there's the famous charge of Richard and his mounted knights down Ambion Hill. It's the fact that the French are trained soldiers, they're trained in the new methods of pike warfare, so they can kneel down, they can hold up those huge 20-foot pikes, and the magnificent chivalry, the royal chivalry of late medieval England, crashed to defeat upon them. So that profound Frenchness of experience. And again, look at Arthur. Arthur, again pointed out correctly by Calder, is brought up largely in Ludlow, in the borderlands of Wales, on the Welsh border, in lands that belonged to the House of Mortimer, that was absorbed into the House of York, following again the model of the eldest son, Prince Edward, the eldest son of Edward IV. So Arthur too has this upbringing which takes him into the world of the Welsh borders and of Welshness. Henry doesn't. Henry VIII is brought up in England, in the, first, not in the English court, but in houses that are on the periphery of the English court, like Eltham Palace, the secondary house to the great royal palace of Greenwich. And again, the profound influence of his mother, of Elizabeth of York, over his early upbringing, and I'm sure, her again, entirely within a world of England. Though, of course, an England which also recognises its debt to France, and particularly to French. Henry VIII is taught French by a native French speaker, and is very proud of the fact, and as we all know, his love letters to Anne Boleyn are in French. But this doesn't stop that profound sense, I think, of Englishness. So very different sort of upbringing, very different attitude, underlying it a form of self-identity, if you like. Now, that I think is a given. But then there's a whole series of complex issues which put themselves on top of that. Because what I would also want to say is I emphasised about the monarchy of Henry VII as being an intensely personal monarchy, a monarchy which in fact, in some ways, it's almost like, again, dangerous language, a kind of quasi mafia dictatorship. The king rules to a very large extent through his personal followers, the so-called bastard feudal following, the people who wear, in fact, it's the badge of the Red Rose at this point, under Henry VII, and the king, if you like, it's a phrase I've always used, ruling as the biggest bastard feudal lord of them all, somewhat outside, as I said, the English tradition, viewing English law not so much as a means of governing as a means of screwing money out of people, famously through Epsom and Dudley. So that odd, intensely personal, semi-detached monarchy of Henry VII. Henry, I don't think, rules like that. Henry, again, to begin with, that's conscious return to a broad-based political settlement, the reintegration of the surviving members of the House of York into friendship with the king, into amity with the king, into being members of the court, and of course the return to war, national war against France. So I think right from the beginning there's a strong element in Henry VIII's kingship, which is a consciously national kingship. So you have an intensely personal monarchy of Henry VII, a national kingship of Henry VIII. Well, a national kingship has to be an English kingship. What does that mean? Because clearly that notion, I would argue, shifts, changes, develops, metastasizes in some ways in the course of the reign, because that notion of being English collides with the two great movements of the early 16th century, which so powerfully colour the reign of Henry VIII, the Renaissance on the one hand and the Reformation on the other. Those two movements, both of which have, if you like, the same founding idea, the so-called ad fontes, the going back to the sources, the going back to, in the Renaissance, to the sources of, first of Latin classical literature, the literature of Rome, and then as it gets more sophisticated and advanced to the original texts of Greek literature as well, and the Reformation, again, that similar ad fontes, that going back to the actual sources of the Bible, stepping behind the translation by Jerome, the Latin translation of the Vulgate, on which so much of the apparatus of the late medieval church was based, and going back to the Greek with Erasmus, and eventually to the Hebrew, to the other complex of languages which had originally formed the very complex text of the Bible. Now those two developments raise absolutely profound questions about the question of England. So if you like, what I would say, Calder, is you are asking throughout this the question of Britain of where Britain, where Britishness. I think the big question of the reign of Henry VIII is entirely different. It is the question of England. Well, eventually, when I come to the second or maybe even the third part of my interchange of my answer to your very long, complex and very important question, we will look at that matter of Britain and the relationship of the matter of England to the matter of Britain. But let's, for the rest of this particular answer, this particular talk, let's focus on the question of England and the problems created for it by the ideas of the Renaissance and of the Reformation. You can see it right at the beginning of Henry's reign with two of the most famous books which emerged from this period, both of them by Sir Thomas More, of course, who is a member of Henry's most inner circle, had known Henry as a boy, had been involved in his education, in the choice particularly of his teachers of Latin, once it's clear that he is going to become, once it's clear that he is actually heir after the death of his elder brother Arthur, and getting rid of the rather old-fashioned figure of Skelton, his original tutor, and his replacement by sophisticated Latinists, heavily coloured by the new approaches to the language of Erasmus himself. And more than in this part of this extraordinarily close-knit circle round Henry, and More's again close friendship and involvement with Erasmus, who spends a lot of time in England in these years at the end of Henry VII's reign and the beginning of Henry VIII's. More writes these two extraordinarily important books, The History of Richard III and Utopia. We don't normally think of them together. We should think of them together. I argue strongly in my essay in this book, The Renaissance in National Context, edited by the alas late Roy Porter and Miklaus Tisch. My essay on England in this develops most of the ideas which I'm now going to talk about, as I said, this matter of England. So what we don't think normally of the history of Richard III and of Utopia as being at all closely connected. One, of course, Utopia is this fantasy of the perfect society, the nowhere society, Utopia. The other is the history of Richard III. Well, I think the two relate absolutely to a single question. Is there a moral value in English society? You see, why is More even asking that question? Well, of course, it was the fundamental issue raised by particularly the literature of Rome, the classical literature of Rome, the classical literature especially of Cicero, the idea of the Republic of Rome, and the values of Romanness, the idea of citizenship, of the duty of the citizen to serve the state, the Republic, to participate in politics, to dedicate his life to the service of the political community, because it had moral value. Indeed, it was from the society that you derived your moral values. Well, of course, there's a fundamental question, isn't there? That was Rome. But then Rome fell. Rome fell in 410 at exactly the moment that it had become Christian. Not exactly, 50 odd years later. And that presented a great problem to the leading Christian of the day, St. Augustine, the Bishop of Hippo, who really shapes, we can all see this now, he really shapes the history of the Western Church, of Western Christianity, at least as much as Jesus himself, or indeed St. Paul. And what Augustine has to do is to grapple with the problem. The Roman state has become Christian, and the Roman state in the West has fallen. Rome, the unvanquished city, has opened its gates, and it's been overcome by the barbarians when it was Christian. And it is the outstanding meditation on this that that St. Augustine writes, The City of God, which debates this issue. And the answer in The City of God is to say that the city of Rome did not have moral value. It was immoral. That all human society here on this earth finally is without absolute moral value. It has relative moral value. It imposes order on the worst aspects of human corruption, because again, St. Augustine believes in the absolute corruption of human nature because of the fall. But the only perfect society, the only society with independent moral value, is the city of God, the Christian church, Christianity. So you have this enormous challenge mounted by the combined movements of the beginning of the 16th century, and they focus and they concentrate themselves in Thomas More. And if you look at the history of Richard III and Utopia in this light, you can see that each one is part of this dialogue. Each one is, as it were, a panel of a diptych. The history of Richard III is the demonstration of the absolute corruption of English politics. It's the equivalent of the city of Rome, that there can be, look at the reign of Richard III, the monstrousness of it, there can be no moral value in this politics. Utopia is about an imagined society in which there really is a Christian ethic, and therefore it is of moral value. If you like, the whole thing comes round to this word res publica, and its translation into English at this point of commonwealth or commonweal. And the great point that More makes, the famous point, that a commonweal necessarily requires things in common. In other words, it requires communism. Well, it would be difficult to think of a society more remote from communism or the values of communal life in most ways than late medieval England and Tudor England. So you get then this sense of the lack of, if you like, serious moral value in the existing commonwealth, the existing values, the existing institutions of late medieval England, of Tudor England. And I think that this question set up by More then triggers an extraordinary dialogue going right across the 16th century. And you can see everybody else who writes on the nature of society, the nature of politics, the nature of English institutions, the nature of values, has to debate this question, has to respond to the challenge put forward by More. The first response, and it's in many ways is actually the foundation of what follows, is by somebody who isn't a genius. He's a bit of a plodder. It's Sir Thomas Eliot's two volumes, huge work in a modern version, 2-volume, The Book of the Governor. And what it is, it takes the ideas of it's written in English, but it draws very heavily on particularly Cicero to offer a program of educating or re-educating the English governing class, the English gentry, in the sort of values and using the techniques of the Roman gentleman, if you like, and to bring home the values of the new Renaissance approach, Renaissance approach to literature, to politics, and so on. But what Eliot does without quite explicitly is to argue for the moral value of England and Englishness, and he does it very, very ingeniously. He actually says that More has mistranslated the word res publica, republic. More translates it as everybody else did, as the commonweal. Well, he points out quite correctly, it doesn't mean the commonweal, it means the public wealth. And that, of course, then enables him to say, all this business of communism, we can throw that out of the window. We can instead look at England as a royal republic, structured socially with an aristocracy like Rome, like the senatorial aristocracy, structured with powerful representative institutions, the English Parliament, very much corresponding to the Roman Senate, a very powerful structure of law, English law, common law, being the only pattern of law in Western Europe that was comparable to Roman law in its complexity, its sophistication, its antiquity, its methods of teaching, its relationship to judicial appointments, and so on. The extraordinary development of English common law, which makes it, as I said, a kind of partner in equal weight with the doctrines of Roman law, the formulation of Roman law in the great codifications of Justinian, the so-called Code. English law, of course, wasn't coded, wasn't put together on the enlightened instructions of a single emperor, of a single king. Instead, it's inductive. It's the work of judicial precedent, arrived at by the common decisions and common adjudications of the profession, actual debates in the Inns of Court called moots, discussions between judges in Exchequer Chamber, and of course the constant pattern of the accumulation of precedent recorded in the yearbooks and recorded in each of the Inns of Court by each generation recording what it had learned and passing on in turn its own knowledge in this extraordinary fashion. So the Eliot then very much argues that England, the English state, the institutions of the English state are comparable to those of the Roman Republic and have value. And although his translation of res publica as public weal doesn't take off, this notion very, very much holds. Now, Eliot's 1520s. Of course, interestingly enough, 1520s are this great moment of divide, this moment, 1521, Henry, with Thomas More at his side, with John Fisher at his side, takes the powerful line against Luther, against the Reformation, against this other great movement of the early 16th century, and writes the assertion of the seven sacraments, the Assertio Septem Sacramentorum, and for 6 years, from 1521 to 1527, you get the extremely successful English resistance to Luther and to Lutheranism, the keeping out to a very large extent of Lutheran books, the elaborate campaigns of propaganda, the public sermons. This is the job of John Fisher. The book burnings, because some did get through at St. Paul's in London in 1521 again and in 1526, and Thomas More very much acting as Minister of Religious Police in enforcing all this. But then suddenly, of course, things turn effectively on a pin's head with the extraordinary decision of Henry and Anne Boleyn to marry. And I've argued this point endlessly, I won't go over the detail, that agreement on the 1st of January 1527 that they would marry, which throws everything in the air and leads to, eventually, 6 years later, the declaration of Henry as supreme head on earth only under Christ of the Church of England. Now, the creation, in other words, of a national church. I would argue that this moment, this extraordinary act of religious revolution, because that's what it is the great moment in which the sort of national monarchy of Henry, national as I was describing, because he reverts to the usual patterns of it, more or less the usual patterns of English government. He fights a war against France that involves the cooperation of the aristocracy, the summoning of Parliament, which Henry VII, towards the end of his reign, simply doesn't need to do because of the vast accumulations of wealth that he acquires via the quasi-legal operations of Empson and Dudley. Henry goes back then to a manifestly late medieval tradition of national kingship, trying to be again a Henry V, who also, again, let this be said, in his wars with France, deploys really a developed idea of Englishness, even to the point of advocating the use of the English language. A claim again at the Council of Constance that England is a great nation with its own identity, its own language, its own borders. I mean, it's blood and soil nationalism. But all this takes on completely different dimension and scale with the Reformation itself, with the English Reformation, with a Reformation led from the top by the king, and the king's emergence as the head of a national church. Now, how can we see this actually at work? We can see it, I think, because first of all, you've got to re-engage with English history, and you've got to re-engage with the English language. The foundation of the royal supremacy is a research programme, essentially in English history. It is the claim, it's manufactured, it's doctored, that England had always been different, that rightfully the King of England had always been, in some form or another, head of the church, and that the Roman supremacy over the English church was a usurpation. So what does this sound like? This is a doctrine, isn't it? It's an early form of what I think becomes the fundamental basis of Englishness, English nationalism after the reign of Henry VIII. It's English exceptionalism. We are different. We were different because we really hadn't been part of the general structures of the Catholic Church. We were very, very Catholic, but oh no, we weren't Papists. So there is this reinvention of English history by a perversion, by the way, of the new techniques of the Renaissance itself, with absolutely no regard for truth and a great flourishing of false fact. So that first rooting, rooting in the sense of double O rooting of the royal supremacy in English history. And that then goes again with a passionate assertion of the importance and the new importance of the English language. 1532, very early in this process, you get official editions of Chaucer and John Gower. And they really are official editions, and they're printed by the King's printer, and by Thomas Bartlett, and particularly the introduction to Chaucer is fascinating. It's written by Brian Tuke, Sir Brian Tuke, the Treasurer of the Chamber, sort of at this point, I suppose, the equivalent of the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and politically highly active, and the preface is signed. There is a copy of the book, actually noted by Tuke himself, that he wrote the preface whilst he was waiting for the turning of the tide at Greenwich. So you're at Greenwich, you're the river, the river is at low tide, is a low tide. So the stream of the river is flowing very powerfully towards the east. You want to go west, so what you've got to do, you've got to wait for the high tide to come, which pushes against the Thames. The Thames is tidal, well beyond London, and you are then able to sail. Your rowers are able to take you very, very quickly back towards Westminster. So Tuke writes the preface at this moment outside Greenwich Palace, at the heart of Tudor politics and Tudor policy. And what does he say? He says, predictably, I suppose, Chaucer is the English Homer, or is the English Virgil. In other words, he is the founder poet of English. And then he goes on to develop ideas that you've got then, just like Latin or just like Greek, you've got a founder poet, but you've also got, he claims, a great language. you've got a great poet, and you've got a great language. And he claims, this is extraordinary, he claims an equivalence between English and Latin, and English and French and German and Spanish. Remember, this is, to us it sounds no more than commonplace. To them, of course, it really is heresy. What we forget is Chaucer virtually invents English. In other words, English in the 16th century, the beginning of the 16th century, is barely 200 years old as a recognisable literate and literary language. So here we're advancing a claim that what is really a kind of pigged-in French, this strange combination of what was left of Anglo-Saxon with an increasingly French and indeed increasingly Latin vocabulary, is a serious language. It's a remarkable claim. But of course, you're having to make it, aren't you, if, well, the language of the English Church is to be English. I think this is where, again, all sorts of things start to come together, but just park that notion. So we've got the idea of an English church, we've got the idea of an English people, we've got the idea of an English history. Let's go back to those ideas that are being toyed around with by Thomas More and then Thomas Eliot. There's another very interesting development at exactly this point of the 1530s, written by my namesake, Thomas Starkey. It's called The Dialogue Between Lupset and Poole. And this is something, again, remarkable. It's a dialogue on the government of England, seeing it as an idealised and highly valuable form of government, and arguing, of course, that, again, in a word that remember is being thrown around here a lot, we talk about the Reformation. The Renaissance was a rebirth, the Reformation a reformation. Well, Starkey is saying, that Starkey, not this one. Well, this one says too that the English structure of government, the institutions and traditions and governing class of England was capable of self-reform, was capable of exactly what Thomas More had denied. It's capable, okay, Starkey says, we're not perfect. There are in fact profound things profoundly and grievously wrong with the society of the 1530s, but he is arguing that England actually has the moral strength to reform itself. So you're coming up then with this idea of a great language, a language great enough actually, well, to carry the word of God, to carry the Bible, to carry, eventually, the language of the church, the language of worship. You're coming up with the idea of a polity that is not only not without moral value, that is not only, as Eliot said, a polity which can bear comparison with Rome, but is a polity, a structure, a set of institutions and values which is actually capable of self-reform. All of these ideas coming in. So you see, you're pushing back on that whole notion of the city of God and the imperfection down here and the perfection up there. And you're actually saying down here, well, society has its values, because of course, well, this is inevitable, isn't it? If you have a Church of England and you have a king who is both King of England and head of the church, what you're really saying is that there is a kind of national Christianity, isn't it? Again, an extraordinary idea. We are used to the notion of Christianity as supranational, the idea, the famous phrases in Paul, that there is neither Greek nor Jew nor Roman in Christianity, that we are all equal in the sight of God. This is a very, very different view. This is the view which is inevitable if you have the idea of a national church, that, to put it another way, God actually wills you to be born English. So patriotism, far from being an expression as St. Augustine would have it, of a kind of fallen state, of the inadequate world of pagan Rome, the inadequate world of pagan Rome to be transcended by the city of God, this becomes very different, doesn't it? What you're actually saying is, well, you're saying God wills me to be born an Englishman. Now, that means that patriotism, far from being something which a Christian shouldn't practice, actually is a Christian obligation. It then raises the question, doesn't it? Doesn't that mean that it's also a moral obligation, a Christian obligation, to fight for your country? So do you see what we mean? What I'm saying? The extraordinary patterns of the Reformation and the Renaissance, as they play themselves out in the reign of Henry VIII, all focus on a remoralization of the idea of being English. You give it this immensely powerful moral, linguistic, intellectual, religious context. And of course, the very pressures of the time contrive to exaggerate that and to exacerbate it, don't they? Because I made the point about English exceptionalism. Well, of course, England really is exceptional in that it's the only one of the great monarchies that breaks with Rome at this point. And by 1539, you have the position in which the two great continental monarchies of France and the whole and Charles V, the Holy Roman Empire, this gigantic super-state unified simply personally by Charles, of Spain, the Spanish dominions in the New World, of the Duchy of Milan, of the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, of the Holy Roman Empire, of Austria, of the Netherlands, or whatever. This, in other words, pretty well all Europe apart from France. So when you get the coming together of Francis I and Charles V at the Treaties of Nice in 1539, you get this threat of whole Europe turning against pariah England. Look at that. Isn't that the origin of the great myth? The myth of England alone, the myth of the Armada, the myth of England against Napoleon, the reality of England against Hitler. So you first play this out in the religious context of the late 1530s, the beginning of the 1540s. And what Henry does in response to that, of course, you get this enormous barrage of propaganda about being English, about your duty to fight for England, about the redefinition of England. Again, when I was talking about the career of Henry VII, I emphasise the extraordinary fluidities of his identity. Somebody born in Wales, brought up in Brittany and France, and coming back to England, really not, I think, having very much of a sense of being English or belonging to England at all. What happens in the reign of Henry VIII, particularly after the Treaty of Nice, is that you redefine England as separate and as different. We've already elevated the notion of the English language, and at this point you redefine English geography. As I've said before, it's very fluid. I constantly make this point, that in the Middle Ages, England is rarely separate. It is part of some kind of great cross-channel enterprise, the Plantagenet Empire, its semi-recreation by Edward III, much more effectively again in the dual monarchy, the very brief dual monarchy of Henry V and so on. What Henry VIII does, despite all his activities in seeking to expand the Pale of Calais, his dominions in France, what Henry does from 1539 onwards is to redefine England as separate, as an island, as distinct, to turn, in the phrase that I've always used, the channel from what it had been in the Middle Ages. The channel in the Middle Ages isn't a barrier, it's a means of communication. As I've constantly said, if you actually look at all the shifts of dynasty and whatever in the Middle Ages, they're the result of foreign invasion, because it's very easy to cross over the narrow seas and very easy to land in England because there are so many good harbours. Henry VII's own voyage in 1485, as I've described it, really is and should be seen as a French invasion. Similarly, the landing of Edward IV when he returns to reclaim his kingdom in 1471 is very much a Low Countries venture. That's where he sails from, and he is as close in his relationships with the Low Countries as Henry VII, as Henry and Bruges and whatever, as Henry VII was to be with Brittany. It changes under Henry. What Henry does to resist the threat of a joint invasion, which doesn't happen, but that. How were they to know the threat of the joint invasion from Europe, a kind of united Europe, united as Europe would be under Napoleon, united again as Europe would be under Hitler, the threat of invasion of England? What he does is it's an extraordinary exercise of both mapping and fortification and naval architecture. Henry has the entire coastline surveyed from the Scottish border right round to Milford Haven, where his father had landed when he was returning to England. They're not proper maps, they're kind of, not in our sense of the word, certainly not contour maps, but they are remarkable perspective views of the coast and of all the great landing spots. And what Henry does, he's got a great map table in his private apartments at Whitehall, a huge slate-top table on which you can both draw and array these things, and the maps survive. Most of them survive in the Cottonian collection in the British Library, and you can see Henry, some of the places he's visited, most he hasn't, but exercising an extraordinary strategic judgment in where forts are to be placed. And the forts are, of course, the thing that they're especially common around here where I am speaking now from the extreme southeast of Kent, and all around the coast here, of course, because this is the point at which the narrow seas are the narrowest, hence the fact that all the immigrants are landing on Dover Beach. Well, Henry could see them off because he plants these extraordinary squat, the round geometric forts modelled on Queenborough Castle, again of the reign of Edward III, which he'd seen as a young man, these extraordinary squat, brutal, small but very, very powerful forts, which are designed as gun platforms so the guns can actually cover the convenient landing spots within the harbours where ships can float in, and either moor or beach, and the gun platforms are designed to shoot them down. So you create then a mapping which gives you an idea of England, and then you literally fortify the frontier of England with stone and with cannon, and then beyond that, you come up with the new organisation. Henry lays the foundation. Henry VIII lays the foundation of the continuing institutional structure of what becomes the Royal Navy. The heavily armed warships like the Mary Rose, which is rebuilt, and of course, probably because the excessive rebuilding sinks in when the French invasion does take place in 1485. The thing topples over and sinks. But the Mary Rose is this experimental, it's the first real battleship, it's the first real man of war in which you bring the guns down from the upper decks and you put them in the belly of the ship, which means you can have far more guns, they can be far heavier, they can shoot, they can fire much more heavy projectiles, and you can get the actual proper broadside. And it would seem that it was endeavouring to deliver one of those broadsides and maybe to tack shortly afterwards, that the Mary Rose took water through. Again, what you need if you have your guns right down there, the gun ports, so you've got guns on retractable carriages, so you can pull them back, and gun ports that you can close because the guns are so near the waterline. And it would appear they didn't close the gun ports, and the ship goes down. But nevertheless, it is the pioneering example of the serious, heavily armed battleship. So you create then a sense of England as an embattled island. England as an embattled island, and Henry as the king of this island. It sounds again, doesn't it, a little bit like Utopia, but it's a utopia that's not anywhere, that's not nowhere. It's here, it's now, it's England, and of course it's sanctified by the prayers of the new church. It's sanctified by the fact that the Bible, even under Henry, goes into English, this language now elevated into a great language, great enough to be a vehicle of the Word of God. And that, I think, finally is the key element of the reign of Henry. You have the idea of the English not simply as an exceptional people, but as a people exceptional because they're a new Israel. They are the new people of the book, those who carry God's purpose on earth. It's extraordinary, monstrous. It has vast implications for the future of England, Britain, and of the world. And it's how this idea of Englishness collides with the idea of Britain and of the world and all the other issues that are raised by your question, Calde, that I will deal with in my next Q&A. But thank you very much for a question that raises such absolutely profound issues. Hello, and thank you for watching David Starkey Talks. If, as I very much hope, you're enjoying them, why not become more actively involved and join my members club? As a member, you'll be able to take part in the members-only weekly question and answer session, suggest topics for forthcoming videos, and have priority booking for my forthcoming live events. And while you're at it, why not have a look at the store page on my website, davidstarkey.com. There you can purchase t-shirts and other merchandise, buy signed copies of my books, and, if you're feeling brave and a bit flush, even arrange to take me out to lunch. Thank you once again for watching. I look forward to hearing from you and to welcoming you to my members club.